Good afternoon and welcome to part two of chapter two. We are going to discuss New Netherlands. There we go, New Netherlands. And also 17th century warfare with native societies in the New World. Believe it or not, this is a picture of downtown Manhattan as it would have looked in 1653. The Dutch controlled most of the Hudson River Valley during this period. In 1609, Henry Hudson had sailed up the Hudson River in search of a northwest passage. People were still looking for China. He'd been hired by the Dutch East India Company to find such a thing. And 1614, a trading post was established at what was called Fort Nassau. It's now Albany, New York. It was in Mohican hands. 1614, the Dutch joined the Mohicans and the Mohawks in a raid on the Susquehannocks. This is a rather typical example of making an alliance with one tribe in order to attack the traditional enemies of that tribe, where the newcomers are getting involved in Native American long-standing political discord. By the 1620s, there's a trade network within Long Island Sound, the Delaware Valley, and the Hudson River Valley, up and down those coasts. By 1621, the Dutch East India Company has a monopoly on commerce between the Americas, West Africa, and the Netherlands, at least for the Dutch, and they were told to establish colonies. That mostly dealt with South America and the Caribbean, where the money was. If you follow the money, Brazil was much more profitable. 1624, they finally send colonists to New Netherland, and that was really the founding of New Amsterdam. Let's see here. 1626, the company purchases Manhattan. It only had 300 colonists by 1630. They were less anxious to develop the New Netherlands. It wasn't as profitable as their South Asian and Southeast Asian colonies. Holland in the 17th century was undergoing a golden age. 17th century had the Dutch had few reasons to leave Holland, and as a result, most folks who settled the New Netherlands were not actually Dutch. They were people from other European countries. 1629, the Dutch East India Company starts offering what they were called patroon ships. A patroon was a supervisor over a large land holding. Large land grants to those who bring a minimum of 50 settlers with them. The land was intended to be completely self-sufficient entities, practically medieval holdings. Rensselaerswyck was mentioned as an exemplar in your textbook. The town of Rensselaer still stands. It was in the middle of that holding. The Delaware Valley breaks away when settlers near Pennsylvania invites the Swedes to take over, and the Susquehanna Indians make an alliance with them. In the 1640s, the Dutch West India Company issues the Charter of Freedoms and Exemptions, 200 acres to anybody who brings 5 settlers. There's a promise of religious freedom, local self-governments. As a result, the New Netherlands were the most ethnically diverse colony up and down the eastern seaboard. As an example of that, in 1644, a visiting Jesuit walked the streets of New Amsterdam and heard 18 different languages spoken in the streets. There's kind of a dark underside to that, a black underside, if you will. New Amsterdam also had the fastest growing African slave population in the New World, or at least in North America. 20% of the population in New Amsterdam was black slave by 1660s. It was the first urban African-American population north of St. Augustine, and for a while it was still possible to earn one's freedom. 1 in 5 blacks by 1664 was a free black. Between, well, let's say the late 1630s and early 1640s, the total population of New Netherlands doubled to 2,000 people. By 1664, it was 10,000, so 5 times as many people. But by then, Virginia was already 40,000 and New England was already 50,000. So you can see it's still a fairly slow growing colony. Now, you're wondering why I have this slide up. The Dutch, kind of like the Jesuits, were careful to learn Native American trade practices. And as a country, we're probably most sympathetic of anybody to trying to learn to get along with the natives and to deal with them on a one-to-one level rather than a superior-inferior sort of relationship. And they figured out early on that natives used tiny little shell beads woven onto a leather strap, what's called wampum, as both a spiritual symbol and as an item of material exchange. They used it for money. And the Dutch started using it as a kind of money as well, even among themselves in downtown Manhattan and downtown New Amsterdam. You could create business exchanges using Native American wampum. And with the Dutch started churning out wampum using iron tools. And pretty soon the natives learned how to use those same iron tools to make wampum themselves. In fact, the Pequots and the Narragansetts on the South New England coast became primary production centers for wampum, and they became economically and politically much more powerful as a result of that. In 1624, the Mohawks displaced the Mohegans off of their traditional lands in order to enforce, and here's the Mohawks, and here's the Mohegans, and here's the Hudson River Valley, to enforce their own ties to that Dutch trade network. And the Dutch are pretty intrepid. I've read some 17th century first-person accounts of Dutch traders walking overland into upper New York State along Native American trails. And the Native American trails were very highly developed. They had little trail huts along the way where you could overnight in the wintertime so you wouldn't freeze to death at regular intervals so that you could walk these trails all over New York State. And the Dutch traders would do that and walk into Native American villages to trade with these people and then write about it later. And these accounts are still out there. Inevitably, as the population went up, frictions mounted between the natives and the newcomers. And there were several wars between the colonists and the Native Americans in the 17th century, not just among the Dutch, not just among the French, not just among the English, not just among the Spanish. It happened to everybody. In the 1630s and 1640s, there were wars over native land in New England, in New Netherlands, and in Virginia. They were starting to get wise that they were on the losing end. In the New Netherlands, William Kieft was the new overseer. He was appointed in 1638 to the Dutch West India Company of New Amsterdam, and he starts to aggressively expand their territory north and east out of Manhattan. He's starting to colonize Long Island, which is already occupied. He starts, the people that are settling there start to put hogs and cattle into the woods. This is something you do with hogs and cattle in the summertime, and then you collect them in the fall to slaughter the young males. But while they're in the woods, they start overrunning the Native American crops. Kieft demands tribute payment from these same people who just had their crops ruined. And what happens is there's warfare for 4 years over the whole thing. Both settlers and natives abandoned the lower Hudson River Valley and West Long Island for several years as too dangerous as this entire area descends into warfare. Meanwhile, back in Virginia, there's a third Anglo-Powhatan War in 1644. Part of it is because tobacco has become such a lucrative trade that farming is expanding rapidly throughout the Tidewater region, and it's provoking Native American attacks. 500 Virginia settlers are killed. The Virginia militia hits these Native American villages, and a massacre ensues. In 1646, the Virginians capture the now elderly second chief that we know of for the Powhatan Confederacy. His successor, the third one that we know of, signs a treaty declaring his people British subjects. Now all of the members of the Powhatan Confederacy have to wear passes, badges, to enter British land. During that war, Thomas Rolfe, the Thomas Rolfe Jr., son of Pocahontas, fights for the settlers on the settlers' behalf and is awarded a commission to govern a fort and rewarded with hundreds of acres. Meanwhile, up in New England, the Pequots, down here near what's now Mystic Seaport in southeastern Connecticut, rise up against the rapidly expanding Puritan settlements. The Dutch had attempted to create a new trading post on Connecticut River. The Pequots wanted to protect their monopoly on the wampum trade and declare war on the Narragansetts and the Mohicans. The Dutch kill a Pequot sachem, Tatobem. The Pequots were also hit by smallpox in the 1830s. 1830s, there were all those new dissenters moving into Rhode Island and Connecticut, the traditional Pequot homeland. 1636, 2 New England traders are murdered. These are guys who are just trying to trade with the Indians. The Pequots are blamed for the murders. Narragansetts and the Mohicans side with the Puritans. And in May of 1636, the English and their allies surround a palisaded village of the Pequots on the Mystic River. This is what the palisaded village looked like at the time. The warriors of the Pequots were already gone. They were out on the warpath. So the only people home in the village were the elderly, the women, and the children. Well, you know what happens. The village was set afire, and people stood outside the 2 entrances at one end and the other. And people were clubbed or shot down as they tried to get out of the inflamed village. 300 old men, 700 women and children were killed. The surviving warriors were picked off or sold into slavery or tortured to death by the natives as they came back to try and save their village. Thus ended the first early wars of the early 17th century in New England.